The crucifixion. When it comes to Jesus' crucifixion, many Christians and people in general imagine the crucifixion of Jesus as portrayed in Christian art and in film. However, this does not match the historical way the Romans crucified their victims as found in burial and skeleton remains, which was done in a way to support the weight of the body when put on the cross and to prolong the suffering of the individual. This was reserved for rebels, murderers and thieves, a way to shock the victim and to shock onlookers to send a message. This is what happens to those that mess with Rome, and if you mess with Rome, this will happen to you. Now, new evidence supports ways that people were crucified using the victim remains that were found through archaeological remains. Now, this being said, I was taught that the nails would go through the wrist as to support the weight of the body, as if the nails went through the hands, the nail would split through the hands. However, we have new evidence that supports that the victims were tied using rope, that their hands were tacked. So the nails went through here, the hands were tacked in order to limit movement. Now, the nails would also go through the ankle bone. In some cases, 2 ankle bones or 1 ankle bone, then going through a bit of the foot in order to increase discomfort and to limit movement. Now, let's go into one such body that was crucified around the 1st century. His name was Jehonan. Now, we know nothing about this man except that he was crucified. Now, the way that he was crucified, let's look into this. Now, if we notice where the nails are, they're above his wrist. It's in the palms of his hand, basically. So this was to limit movement of the body, where his wrists would be tied by rope. Now, the reason why scientists thought that the nails went into the wrist was to support the weight of the body. However, we know now that it wasn't reliant on the weight, it was using rope. And they would have a little seat that they could basically sort of sit on, but it would also be very thin, so it would also decrease comfort, and they would be made to support their weight of their body, basically, and it will make each breath more difficult to breathe. So now that you notice that his wrists are tied, you can see where their hands are tacked, and now notice his feet. You can see his feet are somewhat tacked. A nail is going through the ankle bone while going through the other foot, with a piece of wood there to tack it to limit movement. The bench there to support the body and make it more difficult to breathe. People would take to up to 48 hours to 3 to 4 days to die, and even accounts up to a week. So this was to prolong the suffering. The Romans knew what they were doing. It was a crime to take off the body off the cross, as you yourself could be crucified, even if you were a Roman. So Romans would stick together, so they would know not to do this, especially legionnaires. Now, this being said, the victims' legs were often broken as well. So we have very questionable motives here, especially when you see the crucifixion of Jesus, but we will get into this. Now, let's go on to the next victim. The next victim we have here, his name is Antigonus. He was King Herod's rival, who King Herod handed into Antony, who Mark Antony, would then order to be crucified and then beheaded. Now, if you notice here, his arms are tied behind the cross, his hands are also tacked, and his ankles have 2 nails going into them. So this was also to prolong his suffering. Now, because of his noble blood, he would be beheaded afterwards. Now, he was the king of Judea and also the high priest. Now, because of his rebellious nature against Rome for leading a rebellion, he was treated like a common rebel and was crucified. But because of his noble birth, he was beheaded. So he suffered a double death of sorts. This would have also been superstitious as well. But again, people of noble birth were treated differently in these times compared to, say, a peasant. Now, some crucified victims were nailed to a tree. There's some Christians that believe that Jesus was nailed to a tree, as it is mentioned in the Bible. Now, this being said, some crucified victims were placed onto a cross and even had a stick lodged into their groin or buttocks to increase pain and discomfort. Now, prisoners were often paraded through the streets to be spat on, to be ridiculed, mocked, and to be whipped to the place of crucifixion where they would be crucified. Some were made to carry the cross beam to increase discomfort and exhaustion, as many people who died on the cross died of exhaustion, died from dehydration, from heat stroke, from exposure, and also from suffocation, as it became more difficult to breathe every breath on the cross. It was a horrible way of dying. So it was made to be a spectacle, so that way others could see you being crucified, to be in fear that it could happen to them. And the place that Jesus was crucified, the place of the skull. Now, this had 500 people there crucified daily during the Jewish revolt against the Romans. This was to send a message to the Jewish people: do not oppose Rome, as this was reserved for rebels, highwaymen, murderers and thieves. Now, usually the bodies were left there to rot and decompose and fall apart, And even after then, they were thrown into a ditch. A family member could pay the Roman government off in order to receive the body, though this was usually a private affair. So to have Jesus taken off the cross so early, his family or his followers must have paid a large tribute in order to do so. Now, the depictions you see of Jesus wearing a linen cloth being crucified, this was done in order to limit nudity. Now, crucified victims were crucified naked. The Romans weren't concerned so much of nudity back then. This was done in order to insult them. But the Jewish people, to look at a naked body was even considered a sin. So this was done in mockery of their traditions, as the Romans didn't quite understand Judaism at its time. They didn't understand it was diverse. All they knew that Yahweh was a war god, and they assumed that all Jews worshipped Yahweh. This wasn't the case at the time. So let's go on further. Now, some of Jesus' followers were also armed. Peter, for instance. So the Romans would have viewed Jesus and his followers as rebels. So this is why some believe to this day that Jesus could have been a rebel. Now, the religious establishment hated Jesus. Now, I don't believe that he was a rebel. The reason why is because he was against violence. I believe that he was a rebel of sorts, but not one of the sword. He was one who was anti-political and anti-corruption. So he was a free thinker of his time. Now, during the scene here of Jesus going to the temple, you have him releasing pigeons. This is doves. This is dualistic. He was releasing the sacrificial animals, and he was also releasing the temple priestesses, the temple prostitutes. So young girls that are raised at the temple in order to be guaranteed virgins to be married off. So here we have here. Let's go read it in Matthew 21:12. Jesus went into the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the stalls of those who sold pigeons, doves, so also temple priestesses, temple prostitutes, and said to them, "It is written in the scripture that God said, my temple will be called a house of prayer, but you will make it a hideout of thieves." So this also could be predator. This can also be a disgusting place. You've turned it into a grotto. So let's go up. The blind and the cripple came to him in the temple, and he healed them. The chief priests and the teachers of the law became angry when they saw the wonderful things he was doing, and the children shouting in the temple praised to David's son. These children here, these were the temple prostitutes that he was freeing. So these are young girls being raised off. So virgin girls being sold off. So teenagers even. There were also young boys there. So groomed off to be the next rabbis. Now, this being said, there was a lot of corruption going on in this time of the world. There were also Greek-speaking Jews as well. You would have had Greeks that were living in Judea. You even had some zealots going off killing some Greeks there because they were going there looking for their young boys as well, as this was a part of Greek custom to find a younger boy to teach on your art. So this is different in today's society. This is frowned upon now. This is disgusting. But this was a part of life in ancient Greece as well. So you go to Athens. The noble class would have to hire bodyguards for their teenage boys or young boys to stop older men from seducing them. Now, the Romans were even doing the same thing, were buying young boys. This was a part of their customs and culture. This was not a part of Judaism. Now, also Canaanites having their children sacrificed. So again, this is all this corruption in the temple. So Jesus is cracking the shits here. He's going off and saying that you've turned this into a disgusting place, you highwaymen, you predators, sellers of children. Now, he's taken over the temple. He's stopped them from taking out the temple drugs. So let's go read what he stops from going through the temple courtyard. Okay, so this is Mark 11:15. When they arrived in Jerusalem, Jesus went to the temple and began to drive out all those who were buying and selling. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the stalls of those who sold pigeons, the doves. And he would not let anyone carry anything through the temple courtyards. He then taught the people, "It is written in the scriptures that God said, my temple will be called a house of prayer for the people of all nations." Now, he says that you've turned it into a hideout of thieves. So again, a hideout for predators as well. Now, this could also be, hideout of thieves, thieves of children. Now, this also means leading people astray, sending them back to Canaanite roots. So this is what Jesus was against. So him belonging to an Essene sort of Gnostic community that would have worshipped an unknown God and a concept of El and Asherah. So he was against this notion of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and this is why the Pharisees and Sadducees were calling him blasphemous, as he was also stopping their trade. So he stopped their distribution. So he stopped the coinage exchange, the money and lending of sacrificial animals, and also the selling of young girls. So now we're going to be reading Mark 15:21. On the way they met a man named Simon who was coming into the city from the country, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Simon was from Cyrene and was the father of Alexander and Rufus. They took Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they tried to give him wine mixed with a drug called myrrh, but Jesus would not drink it. So the reason he refused this is because myrrh was a powerful sex drug as well. It was also used for healing. Now, Jesus, growing up, even being raised in the temple, disputing with rabbis, being educated, being well versed with what was sacred, would have known the effects of this drug. So he's refused to drink. Now, because Jesus has freed children, now this was an insult to him. So they want to give Jesus an erection in order to ridicule him and insult him for his innocence, what he did. Now, this was because Jesus spoke about the innocence within children. The other disciples even tried to stop Jesus from having children coming up to him. And he said, don't keep these ones away from me. Don't be so harsh towards them, as you must be like children yourselves to see the kingdom of God. So regarding the innocence within you. So Jesus understood. He was very ahead of his time. This world back then was very cruel, especially to children, especially to women. So now we're going to read the Gospel of John. So this is 19.31. 19.28. Too early. Alright, so Jesus knew that by now everything had been completed, and in order to make the scripture come true, he said, I am thirsty. A bowl was there full of cheap wine, so a sponge was soaked in the wine, put on a stalk of hyssop, and lifted up to his lips. Jesus drank the wine and said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and died. Now, in the Greek text you find here, antidote. So this most likely being theroy oil, which can knock you out. It can also cure internal bleeding, stop bleeding, and is also a resurrection drug. Hyssop as well is also a medicinal plant as well. It's also associated with royalty and kings. Now, we have here Jesus' side being pierced later on. So this is a check he died, as it was very quick how he died. 6 hours is very quick. It usually takes 48 to 3 to 4 days to die on a cross. So it's most likely here that they've knocked him out. So an inside job. The women that were following him most likely were also around Canaanite communities that were big on growing hemp and also medicinal plants, especially holy sacred plants that would later be used in the temples. Now, this all being said, it's also possible that Jesus also did die on the cross, and that the disciples, being Mary Magdalene as well, seen his spirit. And from there, the resurrection was misinterpreted and put into a physical resurrection. And this could also explain why some early Christians believed that Jesus was a spirit, and why Paul seen the spirit of Jesus. Now, this being said, it is very possible that Jesus was knocked out and appeared to be dead and survived the crucifixion. Though painful, it is possible. Especially having herbs anointed onto his body, having women go into the temple to anoint him. This is very unheard of, especially if you're not married. So this also inclines that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene as she was touching his naked body. Now, Jews only wash the body with water. They don't use herbs, and certainly ones that could enact healing properties. So it's very likely that he survived the crucifixion, which goes into the swoon theory. So usually for people that have been crucified, it takes days to die. Their bodies are left there to decompose. Jesus is the shortest account of death, and to be taken off the cross so quickly is also unheard of. So some people believe that the followers of Jesus paid off the Romans. I more believe that it was an inside job of the women that were growing up around medicinal drugs, as it was common for women to weave and also to make medicine, especially in shaman traditions and priestess traditions, as many women were also growing up around the Canaanite temples, which in turn were persecuted and turned into Judean structure instead. Now, many people were uneducated during the time, especially of the effects of medicinal drugs, and many women were known to know these effects, or shamans and spiritual teachers. But that being said, only a limited few would have this knowledge, especially during this time. So I see this as an inside job with the women that knocked Jesus out to make him look like he was dead, and was an attempt to save him, especially when you go into the account of him being rubbed by herbs during his death. So to me, this is medicinal herbs in order to treat his wounds. So this is very possible. Now, I want to use more scientific structure, more a reasonable or likely account, and this to me seems much more likely. Now, this being said, it's possible, though painful. There's also a family tomb that is said to belong to Jesus and his family. There's Jesus, son of Joseph, son of Mary there. There's Mary and Joseph. There's also a Mary Magdalene there, and a son of Mary Magdalene and Jesus called Judah. There are accounts of Jesus surviving the crucifixion and living a normal life in the Middle East and having a family. So it's interesting when we take into these accounts. Now, Jesus had many followers. Now, say if Mary Magdalene was of the Canaanite community, and he had many women that were following him, Judean women and Canaanite women. The Canaanite women were growing up amongst the Asherah worshippers who were also inclined to know about medicinal arts, especially growing hemp. Now, this would also evolve around acacia trees, as they were also viewed as sacred, and other medicinal plants, as it was a nature goddess that was associated with Asherah. Now, it's very likely that these women had a great knowledge of medicinal arts, so this also increases the chance of this happening. Now, many women were also once belonging to the Canaanite temples and were then taken and forced to convert into Judaism, and their old temples were formed into Judean constructs or structure instead of Canaanite ones. Now, we also have the Zoroastrians. Some Zoroastrians would also follow Jesus, and they were also known for their drug use and medicinal arts. So here, again, this is increasing the likelihood of an inside job, especially with the amount of followers Jesus had. No doubt, many of them wouldn't just want to stand back. Many of them would want to save the teacher, especially the women, as Jesus was a very, very beautiful man, especially towards women. This was very rare during his time and age, especially in the culture of Judean culture. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for joining. Please like and subscribe. Connect to one minor soul. Many blessings, peace and love.